Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
Happy New Year. My name's Al Spry. We have a really cool guest. He's one of our old friends, Patrick K. O'Donnell, writing about the first Navy SEALs.
Absolutely, and what a journey this man has had. We're going to visit with him and refresh you about that journey and talk about his investigation of how the SEALs actually got started. So if you'll stay put, the Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political commentator Al Spry. It's great to be here with you, Reagan.
Happy New Year, Al.
Happy New Year to you, brother.
First edition of 2015.
It is.
2015?
That means I've been doing this show with you now for some 8 years. And, it's gone by pretty quickly, I have to tell you.
It seems like we just got started yesterday. Wow.
Well, just in time for the new year, it looks like gay marriage will be in Florida on January 6th.
It does.
So there was a ban that was voted in by the voters, but that is scheduled to be lifted. However, Pam Bondi, the state's top legal officer, is known as the Attorney General, of course, wants a federal judge to clarify whether clerks in all counties can issue marriage licenses to gay people, because it was struck down by a U.S. district judge, Robert Hinkle. He ruled that Florida's same-sex marriage ban is unconstitutional. He stayed his ruling, but the stay is scheduled to expire on the 5th. The Supreme Court of the United States kicked it back and said the ruling will stand. They're not going to touch it right now.
Yeah.
Maybe too much of a political hot potato. Maybe they're not ready to finally rule on every state. So they're punting it back. And this is Washington County. But we think once it's ruled from a district judge, that's for every county in Florida. I can't see them just saying, well, only in one county. That's never happened in this process in any of the previous states.
The legal advisors to the county clerks suggested that they hold off and get clarification on this thing because they might be subject to prosecution. And in response to that, here in Central Florida, in Orange and Osceola County, Jeff Ashton, the state prosecutor, came out and said if they want to issue them in Orange and Osceola, he is not going to prosecute. Now, on the other hand, over in Brevard, the clerk's legal department said, well, they don't want to stand in the way of anybody's happiness, but they're going to wait and get the clarification. So.
Is this the is this the first southern state to allow the gay marriage?
As I believe, yes.
So you have Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's look deeper into this while we have a few minutes. She obviously is I've heard her described as the Anita Bryant of our generation. Reagan, briefly tell folks who Anita Bryant was.
A famous singer about 40, 45 years ago, coming out of the late 1960s and on into the 1970s. And she had a number of million-selling tunes. She was well-known all over the country. And she became the spokeswoman for the Florida Citrus Association. All the orange juice commercials and getting your citrus from Florida, and she very much came out against any form of gay rights at that time, and she was a leading spokesperson in opposition to any kind of gay rights being granted ever. And so that's and that, of course, that did cost her job as the spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Commission.
And then she faded from history. Yeah. But Pam Bondi, obviously, you made a good point before the show that she's positioning herself to run for governor, and so she has to take a strong stand against gay rights, I guess, for the Republican Party in Florida, because Republicans historically don't really like gay marriage rights as a party. Yeah. In fact, several states in and this is not a bash against, this is just their platform. In Texas, for instance, on the platform it says we're against gay marriage in the Texas GOP.
Yeah.
So I guess that's part of it. But she seems to be very strident in her attempts. She doesn't give up. She says, well, we're not going to have it here. And even when all the judges, of course, it takes her off the hook. You think she wouldn't be that against, because once the judge says it, well, then the legislature in Florida's off the hook. The political operatives in Florida are off the hook because it's ruled by another branch. It's ruled by the judicial branch.
That's exactly
They could
right.
say, "Oh, all they have to do is ignore it," but Pam doesn't want to.
Yeah. Well, we have to pause along our network line here. Let us remind you that you're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
We think Pam is cute anyway. I'm Al Spry.
Yes. And we're going to be joined by his combat historian, Patrick K. O'Donnell. He's been here before. We've known him a long time. He's got a new book called First Seals. And if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined by an old friend of the Florida Roundtable, a gentleman whom I believe is becoming one of the most important and prominent military historians in the United States today. Our good friend Patrick K. O'Donnell is with us. And Patrick, it's so nice to have you back on the Florida Roundtable again.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to be back with both of you.
Well, the occasion of our visit is your brand new book. It's called First Seals, The Untold Story of the Forging of America's Most Elite Unit. Now, Patrick, before we get to that, this might be worth a minute or so here, because we go back, as I said, a number of years, and your very first visit came when you did the first book. And I wanted to kind of, for folks who may not be familiar with your work, refresh their minds a little bit. But in the first Iraq dispute, reporters and journalists and whatnot were embedded with the troops. And you were one of those fellows who was embedded. And just take a minute and tell her how that played into all this history work that you're doing now.
I'm looking at a magazine that my father gave me. It says, Remembering Fallujah 10 Years Later. And it has my book listed as one of the sources. It's called We Were One. And I was a civilian combat historian. I think the only one that did it, that was embedded with a Marine rifle platoon and ended up fighting in the Battle of Fallujah. Not purposely, but it was just the way it happened out to go, because the rifle platoon that I was in had the most casualties during the Battle of Fallujah. I wrote this. Basically, it was a matter of survival, and we ended up fighting house to house for several weeks inside of Fallujah. And, for those that don't remember, it's probably the seminal battle of the Iraq War. It's considered some of the most intense fighting since the Battle of Hue City in Vietnam. And the platoon that I was in had 5 killed in action, and we went in with about 50 men, and there were only about 15 that were still combat effective or ready. At the end of the battle, the rest had been either killed or wounded, some multiple times. It was probably the most intense experience of my life. It allowed me to, as one person said, I can write war now because I've been there. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced it firsthand, hand-to-hand combat, ambushes, everything.
So you were actually fighting and in the mix. It sounds like you were right there, hand to hand and everything.
Nobody was protecting me, and because we couldn't spare a single man. And I cleared houses with those Marines, and it wasn't something that I was trying to, that was not my intent.
Well, did you have previous military experience of any kind?
My experience was no. I was purely a civilian.
Yeah. And
I went over there as a volunteer. I paid my own way. I didn't have a book deal, nothing. And it was pretty traumatic in the sense that my ex-wife divorced me several days beforehand. I was homeless when I went. No book deal, nothing. I used my life savings to go. And My prior military experience was at Fort Polk, Louisiana, with the OBFOR,
Yeah.
which is the opposing force that trains all of our troops. And I went down there as a report. I was going to report on them, and they said, no, you're going to be part of us. And I ended up being part of this opposing force, which, you know, in the Cold War, they acted as the Soviets or the Cubans or whatever, the Chinese or whatever you want to do. But
you were the quote unquote enemy that they would fight against in training.
They were Hezbollah and also Al Qaeda, and so I ended up running around like a terrorist in Fort Polk. I mean, can't make this up. It's pretty amazing. They do all the training down there, and they dress in the original, you know, whatever garb is in the field. And then they have Miles gear, which is like this electronic laser tag type stuff that they outfit all the soldiers with. And they mix in and out with civilians, and they try to realistically train our troops. And they do a very good job down at Fort Polk. And so I was part of the OBFOR, and I survived the entire thing. You know, they were shocked at that. They were like, wow, you have the qualities of a great soldier. You know how to survive. And you can do whatever you want in our unit. And I went over with the 509 Parachute, which is a legendary unit in World War II. They were the most decorated independent parachute battalion of the war. And then the 509 got sent into guard towers right before the Battle of Fallujah in the Green Zone, and I ended up going in with the Marines in the Battle of Fallujah. And you know, that's I have my best friends and brothers to this day are the Marines that I was with in Fallujah. I consider them some of my greatest friends.
How long did you fight for?
Reunion.
How long did you fight with them for? What was the heaviest fighting, and how long did that last?
Well, I was there from the very beginning of the Battle of Fallujah on November 7th, which they sort of officially mark as there were shaping operations that were taking place there. And I started there, and then I was in with the Marine Special Operations Unit at the beginning of the battle, recon, and then I shifted into the assault force, which was 3-1 Lima Company, and the book I wrote was called We Were One. It was a best-selling book, and it's all on the Commandant's reading list. It's required reading for all privates through corporal in the Marine Corps.
Is that right? Your book, isn't that
Yes,
must make you feel very proud then?
It is. It makes me feel proud that the book has been used for training purposes because it captures what a Marine rifleman went through in battle, and it's been used in the School of Infantry for training. There's also a History Channel thing called Shootout D-Day Fallujah, which is out there, and they captured it. You know, but for me, it's just a continuation of 23 years I've spent interviewing America's elite units, the Rangers, Airborne, Special Service Force, and I've spent like 23 years, I thought about this, interviewing badasses, basically, from America. 5,000 of the greatest heroes of America have been recorded by me, and I've written 10 books, and this is their stories. This story is the story, and it's not about me. It's about the individuals that I've interviewed, which are some of the greatest heroes in American history. And I've become, it's kind of cool. I was just reflecting a little bit on it today. It's like I've had the honor and privilege to not only interview these people, but they're my friends. Many of them are my closest friends, and I've been entrusted with their stories. And I feel that is a great honor. It really is. And it's been for me, it's not about writing the book or putting the book out. It's about the journey. And I've had an amazing journey for 23 years.
You most certainly have. What made you decide that it was time? And most people probably don't realize that SEALs of today trace their beginnings back into World War II. What made you decide that it was time to put this together and chronicle the beginning of this elite organization?
First SEALs, which is the current book that I've got, is an untold story, and it's reclaiming lost history in many ways. This is a story that's been buried in the National Archives or buried in these men's minds for 65 years, and many of these guys are dead. It's an incredible story. that begins. Well, I mean, for me, it's sort of the moment that crystallized it was I wanted to write this book in 2002 when I was at the National Archives, going through literally thousands of documents in these boxes that they pull out and they give a researcher. And you're in this beautiful room that overlooks the forest at the National Archives. But inside the archives, there's about 3.5 cubic miles of something called the OSS records, the Office of Strategic Services. This is the first CIA, but it's also the first special operations forces that were created in America. And the archivist pulled out the box. I'm going through the box, and I find this old report called the DuPont Mission, and it's written by this guy named Jack Taylor. And Taylor survives a concentration camp. And I'll never forget, I pulled these pages out, and the staples are rusted on the top. The paper's all brown and yellow and everything else, and I felt like I was the first person reading it. And I'm like, wow, this is amazing, an American that survives a concentration camp. And then it's like I started to pull back Jack Taylor's story. He's a Hollywood dentist from California that tests the first scuba gear in the Shoreham Hotel in 1942. And I started to put together the pieces, and I'm like, wow, this is an amazing story. And for the first time, that's what First SEALs is. It's their incredible story of how an eclectic group of individuals that are kind of ragtag in many ways, but they're all interesting. But that's the beauty of the OSS. They recruit sort of the best and brightest in America during World War II and put them together, and there's some of the most diverse backgrounds. I mean, Dennis from Hollywood, California. The guy that heads it's a part of the Royal Navy, but he was a scriptwriter for Paramount before the war. You've got Sterling Hayden, a movie actor, one of the famous movie actors of the 1940s and like 50s and 60s. That's one of these guys. Archaeologist Ted Mord, who finds the lost temple of the monkey god. I'm not making this up, in Honduras. And Mord is I think sort of the model for Indiana Jones. But these guys are all put together to form the First SEALs, and they do it, and it's an amazing story.
Yeah, I had no idea Sterling Hayden was one of the First SEAls. That's pretty amazing.
And he actually changed his name as he went along.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting stuff.
What happens is Hayden wants to be part of the OSS, and he goes through commando training in Britain, believe it or not, first, breaks his leg, gets kind of washed out, and then kind of sails around in the Bahamas and the Caribbean and gets drunk with some Marines. This is a true story. And he joins the Marine Corps and goes through Marine Corps training. But he realizes that he can't be just Sterling Hayden, so he changes his name to John Hamilton to sort of cloak his identity a little bit. And it doesn't really work out that well. I mean, people are always coming up to him going like, oh, gee, you look like kind of a famous football player. An actor or something?
Patrick, I tell you what, this is a marvelous story, but I'm going to have to ask you to hold your thought there, and we'll come back and finish that up. We do need to take a little bit of a pause along our network line here and remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is military historian Patrick K. O'Donnell. His brand new book is called First SEALs, The Untold Story of the Forging of America's Most Elite Unit, from our friends at Da Capo Press, and we'll continue our conversation in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is combat historian Patrick K. O'Donnell. He's the author of about 10 books. His current effort is one entitled First SEALs, The Untold Story of the Forging of America's Most Elite Unit, from our friends at Da Capo Publishing. It's available at all the fine bookstores and places like Amazon.com. And Patrick, when we had to take our break there, we were talking about the story of Sterling Hayden and getting into the OSS and how he changed his name, and people thought, hey, you look like a famous football player or something. So pick up that thread for us, and let's finish up that story.
One of my favorite parts of the story is how Sterling Hayden meets Jack Taylor, who's this Hollywood dentist. And Taylor's sent over to Cairo, Egypt, to set up the first SEAL base overseas. He's the first operative, and he's mixing in with various people. What's so interesting is the OSS has this eclectic group. They use archaeologists to as agents because they know the old part of the world, the ancient Greece, etc., where this is all going on. If you think of the Guns of Navarone, that's the setting of what we're talking about here, the Eastern Mediterranean, which is dominated by Germany at this time, and there's these islands there in the Eastern Mediterranean that Sterling Hayden and Jack Taylor have to infiltrate. And Hayden shows up in the Cairo headquarters, which is called the Taj Mahal. It's kind of not really your typical spy base. They rent out this posh mansion in Cairo, and Hayden shows up wearing a 357 strapped around his waist, and an American flag. And people they look up at him. One of the archaeologists that's part of this main crew goes, gosh, you look kind of familiar. You look like a famous football player or something. And
he was a big guy,
6'4", 6'5". He was huge, and he had presence. I mean, this guy had not only. I love Sterling Hayden because he's one of the most interesting people in First SEALs. He's self-actualized. This guy, if you read his writings, it's amazing. It's like, people can either, one of his famous quotes, as I'm paraphrasing, is like, you can either die a death of poverty of spirit, or you can be a rich man. And he, in other words, you can either live life or you can't. And this man, he lived life to the full, and it's an incredible story. He goes over there to find a mission, and it doesn't work out that way. There's no mission for him. And he kind of wanders around a little bit and does a little bit of his own sailing out there by himself and Taylor, and Taylor specifically delivers a lot of agents behind enemy lines at a place called Samos and other Greek islands that are occupied by the Nazis, and it's really kind of a neat soup of interesting characters. Like the Archbishop of the island of Samos, for instance, is an MI6 British intelligence agent. You've got those kind of people. Inside of these islands, the Germans have fortified them, and they have to infiltrate agents, etc. And they also pull off a great rescue mission where they rescue hundreds of British troops that are trapped behind the lines. It's 1943, and most people think the war is kind of at a tipping point. But the Germans are very strong in this area. There's a place called Leros where for instance, they launch a parachute operation, the Germans, and take over that garrison. But the entire war shifts towards Italy, and Taylor and Hayden and other OSS operatives, they kind of move towards the sound of the guns, and they all go towards Italy. And Italy is where things are at. In the summer of 1943, for instance, the Allies invade Sicily, and then by September they invade the mainland, the boot of Italy. And it's here that Hayden and Taylor and another guy who I knew quite well. I mean, many of the men in this book were close friends of mine. Lloyd Smith was an accountant after the war in McLean, Virginia, but he was also a wrestler, so we immediately bonded. I used to wrestle in college, and so did he. And Smith was this unassuming guy that I could never understand how he could pull off one of the greatest rescue missions of the war, but he worked with Sterling Hayden and Taylor to do just that. And in November 1943, a C-47, a plane load of nurses and medics crashed behind the lines in Albania. And at the time, Albania was an insurgency combined with an occupation. It looked a lot like kind of Iraq today, in a sense where you've got multiple groups that are fighting each other and fighting the Germans, etc. And the Germans are there, and somehow America had to get out these nurses, and this thing went all the way to the top. The President of the United States was briefed, Wild Bill Donovan was briefed, and what did they do? They tapped Jack Taylor, Lloyd Smith, and Sterling Hayden to figure out a way to get them out. And they infiltrated Smith on a boat called the Yankee, and it's really kind of neat. You know, I mean, I found the file in the National Archives. They had this little ragtag fleet of boats. They had one a high-speed torpedo boat, but they also had the Yankee, which was an old fishing boat that they kind of repurposed. They painted it with camouflage paint, and they threw a 50 caliber machine gun on it, and they had to bring in Lloyd Smith under cover of darkness, and they had to infiltrate him behind the lines, and that's exactly what they did. And here's a guy that was from Pennsylvania, a wrestler that had no cultural awareness or experience. He won Sterling Hayden's .357 Magnum in a poker match, the one that he had strapped on his leg, and he had to bring out the nurses, and that's exactly what he did. It's amazing. He found a moving needle in a moving haystack, and somehow located the nurses, brought them out with the help of the British SOE. And what's kind of cool is that the Guns of Navarone thing kind of percolates here, because Anthony Quayle, one of the stars of the Guns of Navarone, is one of those SOE agents that helps him out. And they bring 20 of those nurses back. 5 of them got kind of detached by accident. And Smith is proud of himself. He's in the bathroom at a place called Bari, Italy, where the OSS has their secret spy base. And who comes over to him and taps him on the shoulder as he's shaving? It's Wild Bill Donovan, and goes, "Congratulations, Lloyd. You've just, pulled off one of the great rescue missions of World War II. You're going back to get the other 5. And that's exactly what they did. Wow. He went back in and got the other 5 nurses out, and he won the Distinguished Service Cross as a result.
How did the Navy SEALs actually form, with the name and the identity and all that? What was the actual circumstance on that?
Well, what happens is the OSS, they create the tactics, the capabilities of sea, air, land commandos, everything, and they developed the technology, the rebreather, the first scuba gear. In fact, the term scuba is coined by Dr. Christian Lambertson, who is one of the OSS men in this book, and his technology sort of pioneers it all. And what happens is, after the war, the OSS is disbanded, and a lot of this stuff is just put in a government warehouse, and the men are kind of mothballed with them. And then what happens is, in 1947, a guy by the name of Red Fane, who was with the UDTs and the SEALs, brings Dr. Lambertson back, and they start to test something called the Sleeping Beauty, which was a one-man submersible that the British had developed, but the OSS had tested and utilized during the war. And this was to basically infiltrate an agent behind the lines. They brought back the rebreathers and everything else. And men like Lambertson and the guy that's on the very cover of my book, John Booth, who's got a rebreather on the cover of First SEALs, he's wearing it underwater, they bring these men back and they train the UDTs. And in 1962, the term SEAL is coined, in the first SEAL Team 1 is stood up, and that's sort of the arc that begins. But all of the capabilities, the origination of the equipment was developed by the OSS, and that's why it's an untold story, is because most of this story has never been told, except for this book.
Patrick, we're at that point in time where we're going to have to take another brief pause along our network line here, but I do want to remind the folks that the book is First SEALs, the untold story of the forging of America's most elite unit, from our friends at DeCapo Publishing. Should be available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Patrick, do you have a website that goes along with this book they can look?
We do. FirstSealsBook.com is the website, and it's This book is featured at Barnes & Noble on the history tables, as well as on the season's best history, which is an end cap. There's a lot of places that you can find first seals.
All right. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is a gentleman who's become a good friend of this program, and I think we have had the privilege of watching him grow into one of America's finest combat military historians, Patrick O'Donnell, in his book, The First SEALs, The Untold Story of the Forging of America's Most Elite Unit, from our friends at DeCapo Press, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com and places like that. And Patrick, thank you so much for spending all of this time with us today. One of the things that I like that you did with this book, at the very conclusion, after all of the stories and the heroism and putting all of this together, you spend some time and tell us what happened to these key players after World War II. And I think too many times that's overlooked. They were a hero, and that's fine, and the heck with the rest of it, you know. But they had lives that they came home to, and you spent some time with that.
I did. Well, for instance, Sterling Hayden goes on to become one of Hollywood's leading men. The famous movie Dr. Strangelove, where he's General Jack Ripper, for instance. There's many other films. And then he sails around the world, it's an incredible story in itself.
He was quite an interesting guy. Yeah,
he really is.
He was in The Godfather, too, the first one, as the police chief.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
There's that angle. There's Dr. Lambertson then goes on to become, he's an interesting individual. He's a medical student initially, and he can't tell his dean what he's doing. But in 1942, he's skipping classes and going down to Washington, D.C. from the University of Pennsylvania to develop this scuba gear that he first develops in the 1930s, and he enhances it, and that is utilized by the Navy SEALs up until the 1980s. That versions of that specific rebreather, it's called, is utilized. He coins the term scuba. A lot of the dive tables that we know today were developed by him. He's the father of combat diving in American history. That's one individual. Jack Taylor has a very tragic ending. He comes home. He survives Mauthausen concentration camp, which, we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but he parachutes behind the lines into Nazi Germany and spends 2 months attempting to he gathers intelligence, but the radio that he had was dropped accidentally in a lake, so he was never able to transmit it back, and the team is rounded up by the Gestapo, and he's eventually taken to Mauthausen concentration camp. I had a great article in the National Review yesterday called America's First SEAL, A Christmas with America's First SEAL, in describing that story a little bit more in detail. But he survives, and what's amazing is he's then a star witness for the Nuremberg trials, and the individuals that sadistically tortured him and killed so many of his fellow inmates are then brought to justice. In the testimony of Jack Taylor brings many of them to justice. And after the war, he tries to go back into the CIA or become a special operative, and it doesn't quite work out. And he eventually goes back to his practice as a dentist. And tragically, Jack Taylor, who was a lifelong pilot, is killed in a plane accident in 1959.
Wow. Patrick, this is an eye-opening story. Those who are interested in our military and where we have come from, the SEALs they come out of World War II and are very much a part of where we are today and special ops and all of that sort of thing. Very, very important. Again, the book is First SEALs, The Untold Story of the Forging of America's Most Elite Unit by Patrick K. O'Donnell from DeCapo Press. All the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com. And Patrick, again, that website?
FirstSealsBook.com, and then my personal website is PatrickKO'Donnell.com.
And let's not forget the SEALs were the ones who killed Bin Laden.
That's right.
Still very active today.
The activities that these men had pioneered and laid the groundwork for, it all culminates with the Bin Laden raid.
And what is up next for Patrick O'Donnell?
What's up next is a trip back to 1776.
Aha! Cool. and that one is probably already in the works. So, Patrick, it is always a distinct pleasure and a privilege to have you with us. And when 1776, when that one is ready, we trust that you will be able to come back and do this with us again. Thank you so much for your time this day, sir.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Florida Roundtable. We are a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area, we are seen 3 times a week on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And again, our thanks to Patrick O'Donnell. If you'll stay put, we'll be back with a closing thought in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Always a pleasure to have Patrick O'Donnell with us. Al, he's got 10 books under his belt now, and he's been with us since the very beginning, and he's doing a fine job. And I think you said it very well. He's passionate about the history that he writes, and you can tell that. You really can.
Winner of the loser of the year in politics.
Okay.
We, of course, consulted with various mediums and so forth, and people of maybe, questionable reputation. But anyway, we came up with the following list. So we have Jeb Bush as the winner of 2014. A dozen years since he last appeared on a ballot. We all thought he was gone. The former governor's late 2014 moves towards a presidential campaign demonstrated the enormous clout and goodwill he still enjoys in America's biggest battleground state, that being our state. He dwarfs both Republican Rick Scott and Republican Marco Rubio in stature. Runner-up is Rick Scott. It looked grim for Florida's oft-maligned incumbent almost until the end, but thanks to an improving economy, a national GOP wave, and a 2-to-1 spending advantage, Scott made Charlie Crist pretty much his bitch. And he's the first major candidate to lose 3 statewide elections running under 3 different party affiliations. Yeah. I think we've heard the last of Charlie, but then you never know.
Well, there's always the television commercials,
The loser, Charlie Crist singing citrus commercials. There you go. Loser 2014, Pam Bondi. Of course, it's hard to imagine how someone who won re-election so handily, her rival George Sheldon could not afford a single TV ad, could emerge from 2014 more wounded and diminished as our Republican Attorney General. Well, put aside the unseemly junkets funded by groups seeking to influence her, Bondi's clumsy communication skills and relentless defense of Florida's gay marriage ban have basically antagonized Florida's gay voters. She's antagonized Hispanic voters over immigration reform. She has a bright political future ahead of her if she moves to Mississippi, according to this author. I did not write that one, right. But that one's pretty funny. Yeah. Of course, the runner-up is John Morgan, who we've had on the show. Lord knows how many more personal injury cases he earned from all his publicity in 2014, but Morgan still lost both his medical marijuana initiative and his shot at installing his pal, Charlie Crist.
And I think that's where we'll see Charlie Crist the most, is in John Morgan television commercials and trying to generate some business here. But,
and of course, we didn't have much time to touch on Cuba, but there has been a lifting of the Cuba embargo, specifics of it, and there is a poll out saying the broad support for ending the trade embargo. Yeah. Diplomatic relations, the support is 64% to 31%. Supporting it, 68% for ending the trade embargo versus 29%, and 74% to 24% ending travel restrictions. That's from an ABC News Washington Post poll.
A week ago, Senator Graham from South Carolina, who's going to be the new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told Bob Schieffer that if the president offers you the job of ambassador to Cuba, don't take it because hell will freeze over before we have an ambassador to Cuba. So we'll see what happens. We're going to spend some time talking about predictions and what's ahead for this brand new Congress. So thank you for your time this day. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
See you again next week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.